The loudest people usually know the least about the rules they're quoting. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't my alarm. It was the gentle clucking of 4 hens greeting the sunrise from the backyard. The sound had become part of my daily routine. Soft, steady, peaceful. I carried a mug of black coffee onto the back porch just as the October sky shifted from pale gray to streaks of warm orange. A light mist hovered above the grass, and the fresh scent of pine drifted through the neighborhood. Then I noticed the white SUV. It rolled slowly down Brookstone Ridge Drive before stopping directly in front of my house. Large black letters on the driver's door read, City Inspection Services. Across the street, curtains moved. Garage doors paused halfway open. A man walking his Labrador stopped long enough to watch. My hens continued scratching the ground as if nothing unusual had happened. I took another sip of coffee. The driver's door opened. A man wearing a Navy City jacket stepped out carrying a clipboard and a measuring wheel. Before he reached my front gate, another familiar figure appeared from the sidewalk. Susan Mitchell, president of the Brookstone Ridge Homeowners Association. She wore an ivory blazer, oversized sunglasses, and the same confident smile I'd seen every time another HOA notice appeared in my mailbox. "I hope you're ready," she said before I could even say good morning. "For what?" She glanced toward my backyard. "The inspector." She folded her arms. "I told you those chickens weren't staying." I looked past her toward the city vehicle. The inspector hadn't said a single word yet. He was simply checking the address on his paperwork. Susan smiled wider. "I've been telling the board for weeks that this would happen. The city has standards. So does the HOA." Behind us, one of my hens hopped onto a low wooden perch inside the coop and gave a quiet cluck. The sound almost made me laugh. Susan interpreted my silence as surrender. "I hope you've already started finding them a new home." "I haven't." "You should." I simply nodded toward the sidewalk. "I think we should let the inspector do his job." She seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't arguing. The inspector reached the gate and offered a polite handshake. "Good morning. Nathan Brooks." "That's me. I'm Daniel Foster with City Inspection Services." His voice was calm, professional. "We received a complaint regarding backyard poultry." "I understand. Would you mind if I take a look?" "Not at all." I opened the gate. The hens barely acknowledged us. One continued pecking near the feed tray. Another settled comfortably inside the nesting box. The coop itself sat neatly against the rear fence. Fresh pine shavings covered the floor. Water containers were clean. Feed bins were sealed. Everything looked exactly as it had every morning since I built it. The inspector wrote a few notes before pulling a measuring tape from his bag. Susan stepped forward eagerly. "I've been explaining that this entire setup violates the rules." The inspector looked up briefly. "I'll determine that once I've completed the inspection." For the first time that morning, Susan stopped talking. The only sounds left were birds singing overhead, and my hens quietly scratching through the straw. Standing beside the coop, watching the inspector begin his measurements while Susan waited for the decision she was certain would go her way, I realized something. She believed the law had finally arrived on her side. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the last 6 weeks reading every city ordinance, zoning regulation, and HOA bylaw before building this coop. And in just a few more minutes, one clipboard was about to settle an argument that dozens of emails never could. 6 weeks earlier, the only sounds behind my new house were birds, rustling leaves, and the quiet clucking of 4 curious hens exploring fresh grass for the very first time. That was exactly how I wanted it. After 15 years working as a mechanical engineer, mostly from home, I had finally found a neighborhood that seemed peaceful enough to match the slower life I had been planning for years. Brookstone Ridge wasn't a farm community. It wasn't rural. It was simply a well-kept suburban neighborhood where city ordinances happened to allow residents to keep a small number of backyard hens under specific conditions. No roosters, no commercial farming, just a few hens for fresh eggs. I had researched every regulation before signing the closing papers. The city code, the zoning ordinance, animal control requirements, even the recorded planning commission meetings discussing backyard poultry. Only after confirming every detail did I begin building the coop. It sat neatly against the rear fence, more than the required distance from neighboring homes. The roof matched my house. Fresh cedar siding blended naturally into the landscaping. The enclosed run rested on clean gravel with proper drainage beneath it. Every evening, I swept the walkway. Every morning, I replaced the water. The feed stayed inside sealed metal containers. If someone hadn't heard the hens softly clucking, they might never have noticed the coop at all. The first eggs arrived 3 weeks after I finished building it. Holding that warm brown egg in my hand felt strangely satisfying. Simple, honest, real. The next morning, I carried my coffee onto the porch while the hens wandered quietly through the enclosed run. Sunlight filtered between tall oak trees surrounding the neighborhood. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from somewhere down the street. It almost felt like living outside the city without actually leaving it. Then I heard footsteps. Measured, confident, purposeful. I turned toward the side gate. A woman wearing an immaculate cream blazer and oversized sunglasses stopped beside my mailbox. She smiled politely. "You must be Nathan." "I am." She extended one perfectly manicured hand. "Susan Mitchell. I'm president of the Brookstone Ridge Homeowners Association. Nice to meet you." Her eyes drifted past me toward the backyard. The faint sound of one hen announcing a freshly laid egg echoed through the fence. Susan's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "So," she said carefully, "I wasn't aware someone planned to keep chickens here. I checked with the city before building the coop. I'm talking about the HOA. I checked those documents too." She tilted her head slightly. "Did you?" "I couldn't find any restriction prohibiting backyard hens." For the first time, she didn't immediately answer. Instead, she removed a pair of reading glasses from her purse and glanced toward the fence again. "They're unusual. They're quiet. They don't belong in neighborhoods like this." I smiled politely. "I suppose that's a matter of opinion." She looked directly at me. "No, it's a matter I'll be discussing with the board." Before leaving, she paused at the sidewalk. "You may want to start thinking about another home for them." Then she walked away without another word. I watched her disappear around the corner before turning back toward the coop. One of the hens hopped onto the nesting box, tilted her head, and stared at me with complete indifference. I laughed quietly. Animals have a remarkable talent for ignoring human drama. At the time, I thought Susan's visit had simply been an awkward first impression. I had no idea it was actually the beginning of a 6-week campaign that would fill my mailbox with notices, my inbox with warnings, and eventually bring a city inspector to my front gate. Fortunately for me, I had started reading the rules long before anyone else decided to quote them. The first official HOA letter arrived on a Thursday. It was tucked neatly inside my mailbox between an electric bill and a grocery store flyer, folded with the kind of precision that suggested someone wanted it to feel more important than it really was. Across the top, bold capital letters read, "Notice of alleged community violation." I stood in the driveway reading it while a cool afternoon breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. According to the letter, my backyard chickens were considered inconsistent with the character and appearance of Brookstone Ridge. That wording immediately caught my attention. Not prohibited, not illegal, simply inconsistent. I smiled. Words matter, especially when someone chooses them carefully. Instead of calling the HOA office, I walked inside, opened my laptop, and placed the letter beside the stack of documents I had already collected before building the coop. The city ordinance, the zoning map, the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the architectural guidelines. Every page was highlighted with color-coded notes. I read the violation notice twice. Then I read the governing documents again. Nothing had changed. There was still no rule prohibiting backyard hens. The following Monday, another email arrived. This one came directly from Susan. "Nathan, multiple residents have expressed concerns regarding your chickens. We strongly recommend removing them voluntarily before the board considers additional enforcement measures." No resident names. No specific complaint. No reference to an actual rule. Just another recommendation wrapped in official language. I replied less than 10 minutes later. "Thank you for reaching out. I would appreciate knowing which section of the governing documents prohibits my backyard hens so I can review it carefully." I pressed send. Then I closed my laptop. 3 days passed. No response. Instead, another envelope appeared. This time it invited me to attend the next HOA board meeting. Curiosity got the better of me. Tuesday evening, I walked into the clubhouse carrying nothing more than a notebook and a pen. The room smelled faintly of brewed coffee and fresh carpet cleaner. About 20 homeowners sat in folding chairs while board members arranged papers behind a long table. Susan looked completely at ease. She greeted everyone with polished confidence before finally looking in my direction. When my name appeared on the agenda, she folded her hands. Mr. Brooks, several homeowners have expressed concern that your chickens are lowering neighborhood standards. I nodded politely. I understand. We'd like you to remove them voluntarily. I'd be happy to comply if someone can show me the rule requiring it. Silence. Susan glanced toward the other board members. One flipped through a thick binder. Another adjusted his glasses while scanning several pages. No one answered. Finally, Susan spoke again. The board believes your Coop violates the spirit of the community. I couldn't help noticing she had changed the wording again. First it had been character. Now it was spirit. Still no rule. I respect the spirit of the community, I said calmly. But I'd also like to respect the written rules. Hey. Few homeowners quietly exchanged glances. Someone near the back cleared his throat. The board moved on to the next agenda item without another word. As I walked home beneath the amber glow of the streetlights, my phone buzzed with another email notification. This one was shorter. The HOA will be contacting the appropriate city authorities regarding your chickens. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. That sentence didn't worry me. In fact, it gave me a strange sense of relief. Because unlike opinions, city inspectors don't enforce assumptions. They enforce written law. And I had spent weeks making sure every single line of that law was already on my side. The email confirming the city's inspection arrived the following Friday at exactly 8:17 in the morning. It was surprisingly brief. Mr. Brooks, City Inspection Services has scheduled a compliance inspection regarding your backyard poultry for Tuesday at 9 a.m. Please ensure access to the coop is available. That was it. No accusations. No assumptions. Just a date and a time. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the kitchen window toward the backyard. One of the hens was stretched comfortably beneath the shade of the old maple tree, scratching lazily through the mulch while another pecked at scattered sunflower seeds. They had absolutely no idea they had become the center of a neighborhood controversy. I almost envied them. Instead of feeling nervous, I felt prepared. Over the weekend, I walked around the coop one final time with a printed copy of the municipal ordinance in one hand and a tape measure in the other. Distance from neighboring structures? Compliant. Enclosure height? Compliant. Clean water supply? Compliant. Feed storage? Compliant. Waste management? Compliant. I replaced the pine shavings, swept every corner of the run, tightened 2 loose screws on the gate, and pressure washed the concrete walkway leading to the coop. Not because anything was wrong. Because details matter. Especially when someone else hopes to find one you've overlooked. Late Sunday afternoon, I noticed Susan standing near the sidewalk across the street. She wasn't walking. She was watching. When our eyes met, she smiled politely before crossing toward my driveway. I heard the city finally called. They did. I imagine this has been stressful. I shrugged. Not really. She looked surprised by my answer. I assumed you'd be worried. I've learned worrying doesn't change written regulations. For a moment, neither of us spoke. A gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar from the freshly cleaned coop. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles around the cul-de-sac. The neighborhood felt perfectly ordinary. Only our conversation didn't. Susan folded her arms. Sometimes inspectors notice things homeowners miss. I'm sure they do. I hope you're prepared for every possibility. I am. She studied my face as though searching for uncertainty. Finding none, she simply nodded. We'll see on Tuesday. As she walked away, I realized something important. She genuinely believed the inspection would prove she had been right all along. She wasn't pretending. She had convinced herself that confidence and authority were the same thing. Monday evening, I gathered every document into a single blue folder. Property survey, building sketches, copies of the HOA governing documents, highlighted city ordinances, printed email exchanges, even photographs taken during construction showing the measured setbacks before the first board was installed. I placed the folder beside the front door. Then I stepped outside one last time before sunset. Golden light washed across the backyard. The hens quietly settled inside the coop one by one, each choosing the same familiar perch as they did every evening. The simple rhythm of their routine slowed my breathing. No drama, no panic, just another peaceful night. As darkness settled over Brookstone Ridge, I locked the coop, switched off the porch light, and glanced once more toward the quiet street. In less than 12 hours, a city inspector would walk through my gate with nothing more than a clipboard and the authority to separate opinion from law. Susan expected that morning to end with an empty chicken coop. I had a feeling it would end with something far more valuable than that. The truth, once measured against the rules, rarely needs anyone to raise their voice. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of calm that only exists before something important happens. At 8:30, I carried my coffee onto the back porch for what felt like the 100th inspection of the coop, though I already knew every board, hinge, and latch by heart. The air smelled of damp cedar after a light shower during the night. Tiny droplets still clung to the wire mesh as sunlight slowly broke through the clouds. Inside the run, the hens were completely unconcerned. Hazel scratched beneath the maple tree. Daisy pecked at scattered grain. The other two wandered quietly from one end of the enclosure to the other, occasionally stopping to investigate absolutely nothing. Watching them settled my nerves. At exactly 8:56, I heard tires rolling slowly across the pavement. The White City Inspection Services SUV stopped in front of my house. Right behind it came another familiar vehicle, Susan's silver crossover. She parked deliberately across the street before stepping onto the sidewalk with a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. She wasn't hiding the fact that she intended to witness everything. Several neighbors noticed the unusual activity. Mr. Henderson paused halfway through trimming his hedges. A young mother pushing a stroller slowed as she reached the corner. Even the mail carrier lingered a little longer than usual while organizing envelopes. No one spoke. Everyone watched. The city inspector stepped out first. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." "Good morning. I'm Daniel Foster." We shook hands. "Thank you for making everything accessible." "My pleasure." He glanced toward the backyard. "Shall we begin?" I opened the gate. Susan followed several steps behind without waiting for an invitation. "I submitted the complaint," she announced. "I'd be happy to answer any questions." Daniel acknowledged her with a polite nod. "I appreciate that. First, I'd like to complete my inspection." His tone remained professional, neutral, unhurried. He walked directly to the coop, taking photographs from several angles before opening a small notebook. The first thing he examined wasn't the chickens. It was the structure itself. He measured the distance from the property line, recorded the setback, measured again from the neighboring residence. Then he checked the height of the enclosure. Every number disappeared neatly onto his clipboard. Susan watched closely. "So," she asked, unable to remain silent any longer, "isn't it too close to the fence?" Daniel looked down at his tape measure before answering. "No." He wrote another note. "What about sanitation?" He walked toward the feed containers. The lids were tightly sealed. He lifted one briefly. "Dry feed. No pests. No odor." He checked the water dispensers next. "Fresh. Clean." He crouched near the bedding inside the coop. "Fresh pine shavings. Dry flooring. Excellent ventilation." Again, another note. The only sounds came from his pen moving across paper and the quiet clucking of the hens behind him. Susan shifted her weight impatiently. "There have been concerns about noise." Daniel remained focused. "Have there been complaints documented by animal control?" She hesitated. "Not officially." He nodded once and continued writing. Next, he counted the birds. 1, 2, 3, 4. "No roosters?" "No." He smiled faintly. "I didn't expect to find one." For the first time that morning, I noticed the corners of Susan's smile beginning to disappear. Daniel finished the exterior inspection before turning toward me. "Mr. Brooks, would you happen to have copies of any permits or supporting documents?" "I do." I handed him the blue folder waiting by the porch. Inside were highlighted city ordinances, zoning maps, construction measurements, photographs, and copies of the HOA governing documents. He flipped through each page slowly, carefully, methodically. Susan leaned forward, clearly expecting him to discover something I had missed. Instead, the longer he read, the quieter the entire backyard became. By the time he closed the folder, his expression had changed. He wasn't looking for violations anymore. He was comparing written law to everything standing in front of him. And I could already tell he had reached a conclusion that Susan was not going to enjoy hearing. Daniel closed the blue folder and rested it carefully on the patio table. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The quiet felt heavier than any argument that had filled my inbox during the previous 6 weeks. Finally, the inspector looked up. "Mr. Brooks," he said, Thank you for organizing everything so thoroughly. Of course. He turned another page in his notebook before addressing the small audience that had slowly gathered near the sidewalk. I've completed the inspection. Susan immediately stepped forward. So, he'll need to remove the chickens? Daniel looked at her calmly. No. The single word seemed to stop the morning in its tracks. I'm sorry, Susan asked. The property complies with current municipal regulations. She blinked. But the coop is clearly inappropriate for this neighborhood. My responsibility isn't determining what's appropriate. It's determining whether city ordinances have been violated. He tapped the clipboard lightly. I found no violations. Susan's confident expression began to crack. But surely the setback isn't correct. It exceeds the minimum requirement. What about sanitation? Excellent. The noise. I observed normal behavior for 4 hens. She folded her arms. The HOA received multiple complaints. Daniel nodded politely. That may be an HOA matter. It isn't a municipal violation. For the first time since this entire dispute began, Susan seemed to run out of prepared responses. She glanced toward the neighbors as though expecting someone to support her. No one spoke. Mr. Henderson quietly returned to trimming his hedge. The young mother smiled faintly before continuing down the sidewalk with her stroller. Even the mail carrier resumed delivering letters. The audience dispersed almost as quickly as it had gathered. Daniel handed the blue folder back to me. I appreciate homeowners who take the time to understand the regulations before starting a project. I figured it was worth doing properly. It certainly saved everyone time. He smiled. I'll be closing the complaint as compliant. Those 4 words sounded surprisingly satisfying. Complaint. Closed. Compliant. No celebration. No raised voices. Just facts. Susan wasn't finished. She took one step closer. The HOA still has authority. Daniel answered before I could. Possibly. But if enforcement is based on governing documents, those documents should clearly support any action. He looked toward me. I assume you've reviewed them. I have. He nodded. That's obvious. Susan's jaw tightened. She opened her portfolio and shuffled through several printed pages before stopping abruptly. For a brief moment, I caught sight of highlighted HOA bylaws. The same pages I had highlighted weeks earlier. The same pages that never prohibited backyard hens. She slowly closed the folder without saying another word. The irony wasn't lost on me. For weeks, she had insisted I hadn't read the rules. Now the rules themselves had quietly ended the conversation. Daniel walked toward his vehicle before pausing beside the driveway. One suggestion. Sure. Keep copies of all your documentation. If another complaint comes in, you'll already have everything you need. I plan to. He smiled once more before climbing into the SUV. As the engine started, the hens resumed scratching through the straw as though nothing unusual had happened. To them, it had simply been another Tuesday morning. To me, it felt like the first peaceful morning in weeks. Across the street, Susan stood silently beside her crossover, staring toward the coop one final time before getting inside. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply drove away. Watching her disappear around the corner, I realized something almost amusing. She had spent 6 weeks trying to prove that my chickens didn't belong here. Instead, the official inspection had established something far more important. The chickens had always belonged. The paperwork had simply caught up with the truth. The inspection report arrived 3 days later. Not in my mailbox. In the inbox of every HOA board member. I knew because the board secretary copied me on the email shortly after noon. The subject line was refreshingly simple. City inspection findings, complaint closed. No dramatic language. No legal threats. Just an official report attached as a PDF. I opened it while sitting on my back porch with a fresh cup of coffee. The hens wandered quietly through the run, completely unaware that they had just become the most thoroughly documented chickens in Brookstone Ridge. The report was exactly what I expected. Property inspected. All setback requirements satisfied. Enclosure compliant. Sanitation satisfactory. Number of hens within municipal limits. No nuisance conditions observed. Complaint closed. Near the bottom of the final page, one sentence stood out. No corrective action is required by the property owner. I read it twice before quietly closing my laptop. For 6 weeks, I had imagined dozens of different outcomes. None of them felt as satisfying as that single sentence. Late that afternoon, another email appeared. This one came from the HOA. The board had scheduled a special meeting for Monday evening. Agenda Item 1. Review of Property Complaint, Lot 18. My property. Apparently, the conversation wasn't over yet. Monday arrived beneath clear blue skies. As I walked toward the clubhouse carrying the same blue folder I had shown Daniel, I noticed something different. People smiled. Not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge they had already heard what the city had concluded. Inside, nearly every chair was occupied. Word had spread quickly. Susan sat at the front table with several binders stacked neatly beside her. She looked composed, but not nearly as confident as she had during previous meetings. The board chairman called the meeting to order. Routine business came first. Budget updates, pool maintenance, holiday decorations. Then he adjusted his glasses. Our next item concerns the city inspection conducted at Mr. Nathan Brooks' residence. The room became perfectly still. The chairman lifted a printed copy of the report. For the record, City Inspection Services found no violations. He paused. The complaint has been officially closed. Several homeowners exchanged quiet glances. The chairman continued reading. The inspection confirmed full compliance with all applicable municipal regulations. He lowered the report. Mrs. Mitchell, would you like to add anything before the board discusses the matter? Susan stood slowly. I acted based on concerns that were brought to the association. The chairman nodded politely. Can you identify a governing document that prohibits backyard hens under the current CC and RS? She opened one binder, then another. Page after page turned beneath her fingertips. The room remained silent except for paper sliding across the table. Finally, she looked up. No, it was barely above a whisper. The chairman asked another question. Can you identify any section authorizing enforcement where no written restriction exists? Again, Susan searched. Again, nothing. She slowly closed the binder. I cannot. No one interrupted. No one celebrated. The silence carried far more weight than applause ever could. One board member leaned toward his microphone. I believe we have a procedural issue rather than a homeowner issue. Another nodded. I agree. The association should verify applicable regulations before issuing violation notices. Heads nodded around the table. The discussion had quietly shifted. I was no longer defending my chickens. The board was examining its own process. Watching the conversation unfold, I realized the city inspector hadn't simply resolved one complaint. He had forced everyone in the room to separate assumptions from actual authority. And for the first time since moving into Brookstone Ridge, the rules themselves, not opinions, had become the center of the discussion. By the end of that week, something unexpected began happening. It didn't start with an apology. It started with questions. Saturday morning, while I was cleaning the nesting boxes, I noticed my next-door neighbor, Mark Henderson, standing near the fence with a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked almost embarrassed. Got a minute? Sure. He nodded toward the coop. I've been meaning to ask, do they really lay eggs almost every day? I smiled. Most of them do. And they aren't noisy. Not unless they think they've accomplished something important. As if on cue, Daisy proudly announced another freshly laid egg. Mark laughed. That's actually quieter than my leaf blower. For the first time in weeks, the conversation had nothing to do with complaints. It was simple curiosity. I handed him one of the warm eggs I had just collected. Take this home. You sure? I've got more than enough. He thanked me and walked away smiling. That small exchange somehow changed the atmosphere around the neighborhood. Within a few days, more neighbors stopped by. Some asked about the breed. Others wanted to know how difficult the coop had been to build. One couple admitted they had never seen such a clean backyard chicken enclosure before. Instead of whispering about violations, people started discussing ventilation, nesting boxes, and feed storage. The difference was almost surreal. One afternoon, I noticed a familiar silver crossover slowing near my driveway. Susan. She didn't stop. She simply drove past, glanced toward the backyard, and continued around the corner. There were no more letters. No more emails. No more warnings. Only silence. About 2 weeks later, the HOA distributed its monthly community newsletter. Halfway through the document, a short notice appeared under board announcements. The association is reviewing several sections of its governing documents to improve consistency between community policies and applicable municipal regulations. That single sentence told me everything. No names were mentioned. No one admitted mistakes. But the wording acknowledged exactly what had happened. The board had discovered the difference between preference and enforceable authority. The following month, another board meeting was held. This time, I attended simply as another homeowner. Near the end of the meeting, a proposal appeared on the agenda. Before issuing future violation notices involving municipal regulations, the HOA would first verify applicable city ordinances and, when appropriate, consult with the relevant department before contacting homeowners. The motion passed unanimously. No debate. No objections. Even Susan voted in favor. Watching that quiet vote felt strangely satisfying. Not because someone had lost, because the process had improved. After the meeting, several residents stopped to chat in the parking lot. Someone joked that my chickens had probably attended more board meetings than most homeowners. Another asked whether I planned to hatch chicks someday. I laughed. 4 hens are enough excitement. For me, driving home beneath the warm glow of the streetlights, I realized the neighborhood looked exactly as it had the day I moved in. The same sidewalks, the same maple trees, the same neatly trimmed lawns. Nothing physical had changed, yet everything felt different. The tension had disappeared because uncertainty had disappeared with it. People now understood where HOA authority ended and where city law began. That clarity benefited everyone, not just me. When I reached home, the hens were already settled on their roosts, feathers fluffed for the night. I locked the coop, listened to the quiet evening breeze moving through the trees, and smiled. 6 weeks earlier, those same gentle clucking sounds had triggered a campaign of complaints. Now they blended naturally into the neighborhood, accepted as just another ordinary part of Brookstone Ridge. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with dramatic speeches or courtroom victories. Sometimes it arrives as something much quieter, a corrected policy, a better process, and a neighborhood that finally learns the value of reading the rules before trying to enforce them. A year has passed since the morning a city inspector walked through my backyard with nothing more than a clipboard. If you drove through Brookstone Ridge today, you would never guess that 4 quiet hens once became the center of the neighborhood's biggest controversy. The maple tree still shades the coop every afternoon. The same cedar fence surrounds the backyard. Every morning, just after sunrise, I still carry a small metal bucket across the dew-covered grass while the hens hurry toward me, convinced breakfast is the most important event in the world. Some routines are worth keeping. Others deserve to change. One Saturday, while collecting eggs, I noticed several children standing outside the fence with their parents. "Can we see the chickens?" one little girl asked. Of course. They watched Hazel hop onto the nesting box while Daisy proudly announced another fresh egg. The children laughed. One father smiled. "I honestly didn't know backyard chickens could be this quiet." "They usually are," I replied. "They just don't make headlines." Everyone laughed. A few weeks later, the HOA hosted its annual community picnic at the neighborhood park. For the first time since moving here, I attended without expecting uncomfortable conversations. Instead, neighbors stopped me to ask about gardening, composting, and raised vegetable beds. Someone joked that fresh eggs had become the unofficial luxury item in Brookstone Ridge. Another asked whether I ever planned to teach a small workshop on building backyard coops. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same project that had once generated official violation notices was now being discussed as a community hobby. Near the end of the afternoon, I saw Susan. She was helping organize raffle prizes beneath a large white tent. When our eyes met, she hesitated for only a moment before walking over. "Nathan." "Susan." She took a slow breath. "I wanted to tell you something." I waited quietly. "I handled your situation poorly." Her voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't forced. It simply sounded honest. I should have verified the rules before assuming I understood them. I nodded. "We all make mistakes. I appreciate that you stayed respectful through all of it." I smiled. I figured the documents would eventually speak for themselves. She gave a small laugh. "They certainly did." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she extended her hand. "Friends." I shook it. "Neighbors." That seemed like the better word. As the evening sun settled behind the trees, I walked home carrying an empty picnic plate and a strangely full sense of peace. Justice hadn't come from embarrassing anyone. It hadn't required revenge. It hadn't depended on someone losing everything. It came from patience, preparation, and the willingness to let facts speak louder than assumptions. When I reached my backyard, the hens greeted me with familiar clucks as though I had been gone for hours instead of one afternoon. I scattered a handful of grain across the run and watched them rush forward together. Simple, predictable, peaceful. Standing there, I remembered the first violation letter that had arrived months earlier. At the time, it had felt like the beginning of a battle. Now it simply felt like the first page of a story that reminded me of something I'll never forget. Rules only matter when they're actually written. Authority only matters when it's exercised responsibly. And real justice is rarely loud. It is patient enough to gather the facts, confident enough to wait for the truth, and steady enough to let fairness reach everyone in the end. Because in every neighborhood, opinions come and go with the wind. But integrity has a way of staying rooted, just like the old maple tree that quietly watched this entire story unfold.